All
And
right. And yeah, I'll go ahead and let Michael introduce himself. Go ahead
sure,
and, yep.
thank you, Ella. I'm gonna set a timer for myself so I don't go wildly over time, which I tend to do sometimes. So let me start that. And what I'm going to do as folks kind of join in is that I'm gonna, I assume I already can, kind of be the host and share my screen. And what I will do is, I'll show you PowerPoint share. Okay, perfect. So ideally you can see, yep, okay. So what I wanna do today is to walk us through kind of three broad areas. And I think this is kind of helpful. And I'll introduce who I am in a second. I have that on the next slide. And if you're wondering about the weird background, I am not sitting on the Bay of San Francisco. This is one of the built-in backdrops from Zoom, but I like it because kids tend to come in and out of my workspace. And so it's easier to not see them. Okay, so what we're gonna do today is look at basically three broad areas, right? One is, in a sense, repression 101. How can we think about and understand repression in a way that is helpful for developing strategies and tactics to mitigate, right, to prevent some of those things. We're also going to look at a key component of that for me, which is threat modeling, which is basically how you can understand the risks that you have and the threats facing you specifically. And then we're going to look at some digital security tools, specifically designed for activists and organizers. So let me say a couple things before we get started. One is if you look in the lower left-hand corner, you see this website, keybase.pub. That currently has a copy of all of the slides I'm going to show you. I have a slide deck of like 60 slides, and I don't plan to use them all, but depending on what questions people have or where the discussion goes, I'll jump around. But most of the slides are very text heavy. For example, the how do I make my Zoom more secure is basically a list of 30 settings. I don't expect anyone to copy those down. There's no reason you have to photograph that with your phone. So all these slides are available as a PDF. You can download them. My suggestion for getting the most out of this is to use a pen and paper or whatever method you like to take notes, and to constantly keep your ear open for what applies to you, right? Most of this won't apply to you. Some of it will apply to you, some of it won't. So in a sense, have the notes, because it has key information that's kind of annoying to write down, but this is not something you have to kind of record in any wholesale sense. So let me say that I like to always start out by saying that I am not a lawyer. I'll talk about the law a fair bit, but I'm not a lawyer. And more importantly, I am not your lawyer. And so this should not be taken as legal advice. I'm happy to consult people, and I regularly consult with people facing pretty serious criminal charges, and I can provide consultation and analysis and talk about past cases and what trends we see, et cetera. But I'm not a lawyer, and this is not legal advice. The second is that laws and technologies change really quick. So I'm going to talk about, for example, how long it can take to crack an iPhone password if your phone is seized by the police. Excuse me. That information is only relevant as of August 2020. That could change tomorrow. Three is that you should assume that this is not a private space. This is a webinar on Zoom. I mean, the information can be freely circulated. And again, if the FBI or other intelligence agencies are doing their job well, they would attend things like this because we're basically discussing their methods. So I always assume that places like this are surveilled, and I try to present information that I would be comfortable presenting in open court. Again, my name is Michael Lodenthal, Dr. Michael Lodenthal. I have two email addresses listed here. The first one allows for an encrypted email exchange if you're talking about sensitive matters. The second is a work project email account, which is more general use. So who am I? Currently, I'm based in Cincinnati, Ohio. I have lived most of my life in Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia. I work as a researcher and a university professor sometimes, as an organizer, and then I run investigations. Currently, I'm involved in 6 ongoing investigations, mostly dealing with far-right networks at the time. I studied political violence and repression, mostly focused on surveillance and state security. I manage 2 large projects. One is called the Prosecution Project, which I would encourage you to check out. The other is the Peace and Justice Studies Association. It's an NGO. Prosecution Project is trying to use big data to untangle how and why people are being charged in particular scenarios with felony political violence. So whether it's a protest or what the state calls terrorism or extremism, we're attempting to quantitatively understand that through big data. So you can look there. We have a lot of interesting stuff. And then as a consultant, I do investigations and I teach surveillance and counter-surveillance. We do threat modeling for different campaigns. some physical security work, and some opposition research. So, for example, we'll investigate who is suing you or who is doing investigations of you. And then I have a number of years of experience, and this is kind of where I come from. So this is the 101 of who I am. But I want to kind of jump right into it. My plan is to talk for the first half to 2/3 of our time, and then to leave ample space for questions. That being said, and I guess Ella and I could have chatted about this a bit, we have the Q&A function set up, so I am more than happy for people to put questions into that. What I would ask, though, is that Ella interrupt me and tell me those questions exist, because I can't actually see when those pop up. But if people have questions, perfect. I'm very nimble. I don't mind being interrupted. It tends to be a lot easier than people waiting till the end if they have a very particular question. So this is me. There's a little picture. It's less relevant because you can see my face. Okay, so what is repression, right? Real basic framework. This is a cell tower, in case you're curious what that is. But what is repression? So in a sense, repression is this broad set of activities and institutions that are used by the government and corporations, right, and increasingly by corporations, to protect themselves and their interests, okay? That's all it is. It's used to shrink movements, divide movements, and disappear movements. A lot of times we think of repression as being hit over the head with a club, right? Which, that is part of it. Physical violence certainly is a part of it. Or we think of it in terms of surveillance. But actually, I think what is more important for us to consider are the ways in which these tactics are used to kind of divide movements, to pit people against one another, typically on the basis of race, class, and politics, though sometimes there's other ways, obviously. And so, why does repression occur? Well, repression occurs for a lot of ways, right? One is that the state, wants to, in a sense, be the only one in charge, right? Max Weber famously called this the monopoly on violence. The idea is that if social movements can kind of vie for power in a way that's outside of state control, that's not good, right? The state prescribes ways in which we can make change. Voting, petitioning, legal marches, et cetera, et cetera. If we're working outside of that, then there is repression as a result. And part of that is because the state has this, in a sense, focus on being the only one in charge, right? Being the only one able to produce force. And so we need to think of repression as not only its most obvious things, so policing, surveillance, intelligence, et cetera, but also these much wider frameworks. For example, what it does to us psychologically. I'll use the term discursively a lot, which basically means how it affects discourse, how it affects the ways in which we discuss a particular topic, right? The way in which repression actually shapes the way, let's say, the so-called United States government discusses anti-fascism, right? Or Antifa in the modern moment is a good example. And so just to kind of begin, activists and organizers face a variety of threats, right? And I'm gonna use those terms. I realize that most people are both activists and organizers, but those are different terms for me. And we face a variety of threats from both state actors, spy agencies, police, prosecutors, et cetera, as well as non-state actors, right? Actors who are not associated with the government. And non-state actors could range from, a local racist troll to, actual organized efforts, corporations suing you, for example, or other investigations by other institutions. So there's both state and non-state actor threats. And these threats are really different depending on who you are, right? Your age, your race, your ethnicity, your gender, your citizenship status, your physical ability, all of these things will change how vulnerable or risk prone you are to different forms of oppression. So I don't want to flatten this to say that we're all the same and we all face similar risks. We fundamentally face different risks, not only based on who we are and where we're operating, but also what we're engaged in, right? Clearly there are some political acts which are more risky than others. And so I'm going to speak in a sense generally, but we need to really think about how it affects, each other, which is why I kind of begin with this threat model. Right? Some of us are at risk for deportation. Some of us are at risk for, massive lawsuits from corporations we may be targeting. And some of us are not. And so understanding your risk assessment is really important. And so we'll focus today mostly on surveillance and intelligence, but there's, other huge fundamental questions we're not going to talk about. So, how do I dress safely for a street action to protect my anonymity or my physical security? How do I mask? How do I use shielding, et cetera, et cetera? I'm not going to talk about any of that, but it's clearly part of a counter-repression strategy, right? How do I create useful false identities for protecting my own anonymity or for infiltrating other groups? That's a huge area. We're not going to talk about it, right? How do you protect yourself when your information is leaked online, right? Doxing. You know, what's a self-defense for doxing? A huge area. We're not going to be able to cover that. So those are just three huge, areas which I'm saying like we could talk about, and I'm happy to provide, resource or information on that. But in a sense, those are talks all in themselves. So today what we're going to use is a general framework to understand what repression is. And in a sense, how we can map that framework onto our own lives. So what we have here on the left-hand side is, in a sense, a list of forms of repression. It kind of begins with censorship and ends in counterinsurgency, very vaguely and without a ton of real logic. These are kind of ordered in terms of escalation. Clearly, counterinsurgency and assassination are an escalated form of repression from defamation and censorship. Excuse me. But as you see, there's all sorts of ways, and we could, talk about any of these for quite a length of time. And my suggestion is always, as in most things on a presentation like this, things that you don't know, look online. Again, I can give you an explanation of what a grand jury is and why it's, functional in repression, but, you can read about that. So again, I'm happy to answer any of these in questions, but if we went through all of them, it would take most of the time we have here. If you're looking for kind of things which maybe are particularly relevant in 2020, I would look at grand juries, right? I would look at the use of conspiracy charges. I'll talk about a little bit later, but we see a lot of that. I would look at infiltration. I would look at false flags. False flags is, doing something and blaming someone else. A lot of folks maybe saw last night that all of a sudden there is a Antifa 2020 recruiting website that got a lot of press between yesterday and today, which is clearly what we call a honeypot, right? Something that's designed to get people to give them the personal information, either to be released by the government or some far-right actor. Things like that are going to, occur more and more and more. Again, all of these could kind of, be their own talk, but I kind of want to just put them out there to paint the broad picture. But what I want to focus on is the kind of right-hand side of the screen, this kind of confusing little diagram. And I can say confusing, I made it, but it's definitely confusing. So what I want to kind of talk about, and I'll use my arrow a little bit. So right here, right, this broad square is in a sense the universe, right? The universe of possible threats that you could experience. Now, most of us focus kind of in this first category, right? Our electronic behaviors. Let's say we don't, we've been taught not to click on sketchy links. We've been taught to, turn on this setting or turn off this other setting. So we have this set of electronic behaviors, which in a sense inform two broad areas, right? Our device security, right? Our phones and our laptops, and our web and network security, right? How we interact with the internet and all of its associated services. And in a sense, a lot of us focus right here in this white box without a lot of mind to some of these other. Right, within, for example, just the simple device of your phone, right, in your device security, we have all sorts of things, right? We have password issues, we have authentication, what we call key issues. We have all these different things which transmit information, right? We have GPS, which does location. We have Bluetooth, which you're aware of. Near field communication, that's like when you go to use Apple Pay or something that requires to be physically proximate. Wi-Fi is as obvious, right? There's all sorts of ways in which your phone kind of relays forms of information which you may or may not have control over. There's also cloud integration, right? You take the picture and you're like, oh, this is a private picture. I'm definitely not gonna, share this with anyone. Well, in the second you take it, your phone auto uploads it to iCloud or Dropbox or things like that, however your phone's set up. And then we have all sorts of other issues with updates and settings, right? Even if the phone exists, how it is set up. So my point is that we'll kind of focus right here, right? What are the good ways to set your stuff up, blah, blah, blah. But we need to keep something else in mind. What we have to keep in mind is that outside of this device security, right, outside of this network security, outside of protecting your laptop or your phone to a virtual private network or having the right settings on your router or your cloud service, et cetera, outside of all that are other threats. And this is where I want your brain at. We can mitigate, we can prevent, we can help with a lot of these threats in this white box. But there are threats which are fundamentally outside of what we're talking about. So let's say we have, well, the classic example that people love to say is the secret ingredient to Coca-Cola, right? That's like, this big piece of intellectual property. So let's say we have that secret to Coke on our phone, right? And we have a good password, we have a long password, we have no biometric security on it, so no one's gonna hold our phone up to our face and get logged in. We have all the right things turned off, all the right things turned on, we have a VPN, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, fine. Our phone is very secure. We can check You can check this box for device security. However, if that phone is sitting on the front seat of your car and someone smashes the window and takes it, that doesn't really, right, the password doesn't matter. Sure, the password might prevent them from accessing it, but as we can talk about later, there's ways to rip information off phones without passwords. So this smash and grab falls outside of our threat model, right? Whatever we do to protect ourselves, this smash and grab falls outside of it. Okay, what about if our phone explodes, right? As Samsung phones have been known to do, right? That's not a threat that you're probably planning for. So if you have this big secret, but the phone explodes, it's not super helpful, right? Same thing here. Let's say we have a really long, complicated password, but someone engages in what is sometimes called shoulder surfing, just means looking over your damn shoulder, right? That's gonna fall outside of the model. Or let's say that you're really good at, maintaining all these security practices, but you get drunk and you send people, regrettable texts, right? And this is, a screenshot from that, right? Drunk texting, smash and grab, exploding phones, and shoulder surfing are all going to be outside of the threat model, which we're going to talk about. So we want to kind of focus today about how we can make this white box better. But regardless of how good we make this white box, let's remember what's outside of it. And there's a lot of things outside of it. In a sense, what I want to leave you with today is a better understanding of one question. How do you balance convenience and security, right? If you make all of these as secure as possible, your life is going to be very inconvenient. And inconvenience will often lead people to limit their own involvement, right? Not only will it limit their ability to become involved, but if you tell people in order to engage in a call, they have to use a virtual private network, they have to tunnel in through some encrypted network, and they have to use a burner phone, that's going to limit people's involvement because they don't feel capable of joining in the conversation, okay? So we want to focus broadly on repression, but when we're trying to think about how we mitigate, how we prevent that repression, we need to think about what we are and are not preventing. So this is embarrassingly short, right? But this is 100 years of repression in one slide, in 4 images. So I want to attempt to kind of just make really broad historical claims so we understand that, what era we're talking about. In a sense, what I would say is that in the last 100 years, we have about 4 eras of repression, right? Four periods of repression that change. The first one occurs in the early part of the 20th century. So this is what we call the Red Scare. Red for communism is the implication. So 1917 to 1920, and then the 47 to 57. This is the foundation of the FBI. This is the Palmer raids. This is all sorts of things like that. The methods used for repression in the Red Scare are very particular. There's a lot of what sociologists call othering, right? Saying those people aren't like us, right? You'll see that a lot in the ongoing protests. They use a lot of citizenship things, so deportation, denaturalization, things like that. There's also a fair bit of the beginning of trying to catalog people on the basis of ideology. This is famously represented very poorly in the biopic movie J. Edgar about J. Edgar Hoover, done by the guy from Titanic, whose name totally escapes me right now, but the main protagonist of Titanic, that plays J. Edgar Hoover. If you want to see this era represented really bizarrely, it's worth 2 hours of your time, I guess. But again, what's important about the Red Scare is that the methods used were largely what we'd call rhetorical, right? To call those people something other than ourselves. It was a lot about defaming those people, putting them on blacklists, right? Saying they are not part of the society, and then trying to deport them. By about the 1950s, this shifts somewhat into what we now know as the counterintelligence program of the FBI, COINTELPRO. COINTELPRO officially begins in 56 and ends in 71, and really focuses its attention on Black and brown communities, specifically the Black Panther Party, the Black Liberation Army, the American Indian Movement, at the time what was called the Chicano Liberation Movement, and some other entities, but largely Black and brown communities, largely in urban centers on the coasts, right, East Coast and West Coast of the United States. Most famously, COINTELPRO involved a lot of violence. So we have the murder of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark around 1969, pictured here, right? At least Fred Hampton shot in his bed. You can see the bullet holes. But again, what we know about COINTELPRO is that it was a massive expansion of surveillance, right? They were listening and bugging everyone. And then they were carrying out lethal violence, which again, we don't really see when we shift into other eras. So it's a particular time period. Fast forward about 30 years into the early parts of the 21st century, what we see is a somewhat odd, and I think for a lot of people, unpredicted shift in what we call the Green Scare. So starting in about 2000 and going for about 10 years until I'd argue about 2007 or 2008, the FBI specifically focuses on what they call eco-terrorism, what I would call environmental and animal rights activists, and really, honed in there. As early as 2003, I want to say, the FBI was calling, oh, well, actually not 2003, it had to be before, it'd be 2000. The FBI, before and after the 9/11 attacks, called eco-terrorists, right, people breaking the law in terms of the environment, the number one, that's a quote, the number one domestic terrorist threat. And for about 10 years, the FBI maintained this posture, that the big threat to American democracy and commerce were people setting fire and sabotaging environmental and animal-related industries. The method of repression there shifted again. It shifted away from direct violence, right? We didn't have the state murder anyone, though one of the more prominent defendants did take their life in custody, so we could argue about that. But what the state did is they infiltrated, they surveilled, and they used a lot of this heavy framing, this defamation. Again, I know I'm going through this very quickly. And then I would say around 2017, we have another shift into what we're currently looking at, which I've called this kind of era of felonization or riotization, not because I like making up words, but because those seem to aptly describe what we're doing. And again, a lot of things are occurring, starting with some of the mobilizations in the early times of the Black Lives Matter movement, really reaching an apex at Standing Rock, and with the January 20th, the J20 prosecutions in Washington, D.C., what we see is that the federal government the federal government accelerated its overcharging of people, right? Giving people 3 charges when 1 would suffice, giving people felony charges when misdemeanors would suffice, and changing the notion of what constitutes a riot. I mean, I couldn't, and I hate to be proven right in these things, but I couldn't be proven more right than what's happening now, right? If you look at what happens in Portland, Oregon right now, right? This is my thesis come to life. It's, a bunch of people standing in line arguing with police, and they get arrested and they're being charged with rioting. It's like there's nothing riotous about that. So what I see in the current era is the state being very flexible about what is a felony and what is a riot, and just overcharging people. And obviously I made this slide well before the uprising, which we're currently undergoing, but I think that kind of proves my point quite well. So what we want to look at in this kind of first part is broadly, how does repression operate, right? And I'm going to go kind of speed through 4 areas: in the courts, in psychology, in kind of policing, and then through discourse and rhetoric. So in the courts, we have lots of different ways in which this changes, right? We have new laws, we have new legal realities. These kind of set the tone of an assembly. In other words, if you are in some cities, a gathering of over 20 people, which creates, quote, grievous risk to property, constitutes a felony riot. So if you know that anytime you go to a demonstration, you run the risk of being arrested as a rioter and facing a felony, that sets the tone of it. It also, what we call prefigure, right? Predetermines who's able to take part, right? Again, on a lot of bases. These tend to, look at, our subjectivities. Again, our citizenship status, our age, our gender, whether or not we have dependents living at home, whether or not we can afford bail, whether or not we live in a city which has cash bail, et cetera. We also see this in arrest and prosecution, right? Who's arrested, how many people are arrested, what kinds of things they're charged with. Again, what's been really interesting to me, I work for the prosecution project. We track all of the arrests coming out of the uprisings, and looking at how people are being charged, right? We've identified 222 federal cases already, and almost 700 or 800 state cases. And so looking at how the state's charging these people, right? Who's charged with a felony, who's charged with a misdemeanor? Who's charged with an interstate crime and who's not, right? Who's charged with, again, there's a lot of really interesting patterns that we're seeing in the ways in which people are being charged. And what we see through prosecution and arrest is that saps resources, right? Saps our money, our time, our energy, our trust. It reduces the activity, right? Because not only are people arrested, thus not in the streets, but their supporters aren't, their lawyers aren't, their wider network. And it recycles fear and trauma, right? It keeps kind of bringing back this notion of the way in which this impacts our lives. If prosecution leads to incarceration, right, leads to going jail or prison, then obviously it further strains our solidarity networks and as well, physically removing people from the streets. So the overall effect of kind of the legal repression, right, in the court repression, is that it serves a precedent to chill dissent. What we call, when the Supreme Court discusses chilling of dissent, they're basically saying, okay, it's not illegal to go out and exercise your First Amendment, rights or freedom of assembly, et cetera. But if we create such a legal reality in which people have a reasonable expectation that by attending a demonstration, they're going to face severe consequences, then that chills dissent, right? It's the equivalent of the state saying, of course you can go out and demonstrate, but the consequences are really severe, it's kind of like leaving it to you. That's the chilling of dissent. And we see that a lot now, right? We have organizers who are being called conspirators. We have pressure campaigns being called racketeering. Again, we have marchers being called rioters, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of that kind of fits into this overall chilling effect. To give this a little bit of specificity, as I said, what I've noticed, at least in the past 4 years, right, since 2016.
Michael?
Yes, please.
We have a question in the chat. Can the government/state be sued for chilling dissent?
Short answer is yes. You can, yes. The short answer is yes. The longer answer is that it would take a lot of resources to sue the federal government for anything. It's not illegal to chill dissent, but it's illegal to set up laws which, in effect, limit your constitutional rights. And just to be clear, I'm a realist. I understand the limits of the law. I think we should all know the law. I think it's very important that we assert our rights. At the same time, those rights are not going to protect you, right? You can say to a police officer, I do not consent to this search, and they can punch you in the face and search your stuff. It can be an illegal search, and you asserting that you don't consent to that search could get it thrown out in court. So I want to be clear that we should know and use the law, but it has limits. So certainly one could sue the government for violating your First Amendment rights, right? Of creating an environment in which it is scary or too dangerous to demonstrate. Because again, you have a constitutional right to assembly. And so if that right to assembly, if that right to speech is limited in effect, right? Not necessarily like they say you can't go out and protest, but if in effect it is limited, you could have a lawsuit. And there have been lawsuits against so-called free speech zones. For example, let's say there's a Republican convention and the city says, you can't demonstrate near the convention center, but we found this park, a quarter mile away, surrounded by a 7-foot high fence. You can demonstrate there. People have sued and been like, that's a chilling of speech. Like, that's not what free speech and free assembly are meant to be. So you can, but you got to understand, obviously, that in going up against the federal government, you got to have a pretty deep pocket and a pretty good lawyer. That being said, ACLU and other groups, love fighting cases like that. So if you have a good case to fight like that, let's talk after this. So again, what I've seen the past 4 or 5 years is looking at all these increase in laws. These slides are taken from a great website called Protest Law Tracker. I forget the exact publisher, but if you type in Protest Law Tracker, you'll find it. And what they basically do is they track anti-protest laws. What I've noticed overall is that most of these laws have increased felony charges. So they just basically say that what used to be a misdemeanor is now a felony. A lot of them also say that different levels of communication constitute conspiracy. So in a sense, they blur the line between organizing a campaign and engaging in a criminal conspiracy. Quite intentionally, they blur that line. Again, there's a huge increase in state riot charges. There's a lot of overcharging laws, which basically just say, again, what used to constitute, a possible fine is now, a major fine. There's a lot of financial restitution laws, some of which even say that demonstrators and demonstration organizers can be held liable for police. So in other words, let's say you organize a demonstration in your town and the state spends $100,000 to bring a bunch of riot cops to police you, that the state can actually transfer that $100,000 cost to the organizers. Be like, well, you had the demonstration, like you have to pay for the police. And so these laws are coming up more and more. And there's also a lot of laws which seem particularly disgusting given how many times this has happened the past couple months. But there's an increasing number of laws which remove liability for police and drivers. In other words, there are laws which make it not a crime to drive into demonstrators, like who are in the street. Typically what these laws say is, the driver doesn't have any additional responsibility they would have operating a motor vehicle, which basically means if the demonstrators are on the road, it's their fault that they get hit by a car. That to me is particularly gross, given the history in the last few years, but you'll see these laws popping up quite a lot. The other thing we see a lot of if people are in the Dakota area, for example, is that there's a lot of critical infrastructure laws. Basically, if you look at what social movements are occurring in a given area, you can predict what kind of laws there are. So during the Standing Rock time period, or during the current campaign led by Appalachians Against Pipelines in West Virginia, those are the states where you see laws which say demonstrating near a gas and oil pipeline is a felony because it constitutes critical infrastructure. If you look at a state like Minneapolis or North Carolina, which has a lot of road blocking Black Lives Matter demonstrations, there's a lot of laws which say blocking the road is a felony. So depending on what kind of movements are active in your particular state will likely determine what kind of laws. Now for better, I was gonna say for better or worse, but for better, most of these laws have been defeated, like most. But there are some that have been passed, and there are a lot which are still being considered. So I would encourage you to check that website, check your own state. You can also sort by type of law. So you can look at just the anti-masking laws, the laws that make it a felony to wear a mask or a hoodie. Some of those laws are pretty absurd. I want to draw your attention just to two pieces of legislation, not because they're like the worst, but because I think they're the most easy to kind of interpret.
Sorry, before you move on,
yeah,
can you
of course.
tell me the name of the website again so I can type it in the chat?
Sure, Protest Law Tracker. I want to say it's run by an organization called ICN or ICL or something like that. I can find it afterwards if not.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah, of course. So these two laws are both proposed as federal laws. And again, I don't really want to go into this too deep, but I want us to kind of look at this. So the first one is House Resolution 6054, the Unmasking Antifa Act of 2018. This didn't pass. But what you see is that some people are like, oh, I'm not an anti-fascist. I don't care about those people. So why would I care about this law? Well, you should, because look at the actual text of the law, right? Quote, in general, whoever, whether or not acting under color of law while in disguise, including wearing a mask, injures, oppresses, threatens, or intimidates any person in any state, territory, blah, 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 in the free exercise or enjoyment of any right or privilege secured to him by the constitutional laws of the United States. So what that basically means, it means a lot of things, but what it could mean is that you have a neo-Nazi, Ku Klux Klan, white supremacist, white nationalist type group, which gets a permit. Anything you do to, what is the word? Anything you do to limit their free exercise is thus triggered by this law. In other words, if the person you're demonstrating against has a permit, right, has some sort of legal reason to be here, then you are not able to try to prevent that free exercise. And so again, this is kind of themed as like a anti-fascists aren't allowing the good the Nazis who took the trouble to get the permit their chance to speak. This kind of both sidism notion. But I think this is a particularly dangerous law because the way it's framed is really quite flexible. It's far more flexible than the other law on the right, which is purely political theater, right? This calling Antifa a domestic terrorist organization. This is silly. It's not really even worth us explaining why it's silly. Trump has brought this back up several times. In short, my brief takedown of this, there is no domestic terrorist organization designation. That does not exist. The Department of Justice, the Department of the Treasury, the White House, all of those entities that would designate something, there is no domestic terrorist organization list that we know of. This is not to say that the FBI doesn't keep lists of domestic movements. Of course they do. But the idea that there is some entity in the government which designates groups as part of a domestic terrorist organization is false. What that refers to is the foreign terrorist organization designation. The United States Department of State and the United States Department of the Treasury designate certain entities, Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, Hamas, Hezbollah, the FARC, take your pick, whatever foreign non-state actor you'd like. They designate those as foreign terrorist organizations. And that means that you can't send them money, you can't work for them, someone can't apply for a visa into the US to work for, Hamas or Hezbollah. et cetera, et cetera. And so being added to the foreign terrorist organization, the FTO list, is a bad thing. It has lots of ramifications. But the idea that like we have a similar list, which people are going to be added to, the KKK or Antifa is the kind of discussion people have, is just, it's just absurd. It's political theater. And so I want to kind of just separate these two types of proposals, right? The one on the left is made to appear as if it's an anti-masking law for Antifa. It's not. It's a broad thing which protects the right, the legal right of white supremacists and other people to assemble. And the one on the right, which seems far more specific, is just ludicrous. And it just has no legal basis in reality. I mean, I encourage you to read the text of both of these. The justification for House Resolution 525 is really laughable. Yeah. So it's, again, the Unmasking Antifa Act is an anti-masking law and needs to be understood as an anti-masking law, not as an anti-fascism law. And again, those are two examples. There's like 100. If you want another example on a totally fundamentally different level, look at the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, AETA. Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act works in a very particular way as well. And we can talk about that later if people are interested. Okay, so we talked about the courts. Let's talk about police and spies or intelligence agents. One is that we don't typically think about the full range of police. We think of police holding clubs like in the street, and sure, that's part of it. But we need to have a much broader understanding of policing. So of course we have state police, right? Municipal, city police. We have things like highway patrol and state highway patrol. We have local police. We have federal police. We have campus police. There are deputized universities, which their police have arrest and lethal force power. There's also federal, obviously, policing agencies. The most famous would be ICE, Customs and Border Patrol. That's actually spelled wrong now, I'm saying. And Federal Protective Services. In relation to the current uprisings, we have policing going on by both the National Guard and other parts of the military apparatus. Within intelligence gathering, and I'll look at this a little bit later in 2 slides, we have mostly done through the FBI. If we're talking about American citizens or people residing in the United States, we tend to mean the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security, as well as private intelligence. If you're looking outside of the United States, we're looking at the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Agency, the CIA and the NSA. So those are uniformed cops, for lack of a better word. We also have in the green, people who are not uniformed or who look different. So we have plainclothes cops, right? Cops who are just, wearing khakis and a shirt who, wander onto your meeting and say, hey, who's in charge here? You guys have seen this, I imagine. We have undercover police who are, plainclothes, but they're intentionally plainclothed in a way to make them blend in. So this is your guy in the, the khaki pants and the polo shirt, but has the button on that says like, I'm vegan. And we're like, oh, you're clearly one of us. Like, come on into our secret meetings. And so like, just to separate out plainclothes and undercover, they're a little different. We also have facilitators. Not all cities have this. Philadelphia, where I'm from, has a really interesting facilitator police panel called Civil Affairs. And these are basically uniformed police who don't carry guns. And their job is to be an intermediary between demonstrators and police. They're very dangerous because they present themselves like neutral arbitrators, but they're not. But again, we need to talk about people like that. Arguably, you could put in there so-called peace police, self-appointed social movement peace police as facilitators. And then we also have a whole nother range of hostile actors, right? We have informants. We have paid confidential informants. We have FBI informants. We have all sorts of people who are misrepresenting themselves. We also have, people who aren't intending to be informants. But for example, during a criminal case I was a part of, one of the main pieces of evidence used against us was the fact that one of the allies in our march had filmed the entire thing on a GoPro camera. And of course, the police subpoenaed that and used that information against us. So that person was not intending to be an informant, but in practice was an informant, and that they filmed all the march from inside the march, and then that information was made available to police. We also have increasing challenges from citizen militias. Again, depending on where you live, this is more or less of a problem. This is a big problem recently in New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado. Historically, it's been a big problem in Michigan and Montana. But this is groups which organize nationally, such as the 3% militia, the Oath Keepers. Those are the two kind of big ones. And then most states have their own little cabal of right-wing guys. And again, I don't want to necessarily say that all citizen militias are bad, because I don't think that. I don't want to paint that broad stroke. but most of the ones who are engaging in policing are pretty awful. Okay, so what do police do? Well, they do a whole range of things, right? They're doing observation, they're doing surveillance, they're doing harassment, they're doing disinformation, right? They're spreading false information. They're agent provocateurs, right? They're people who are getting into a demonstration and kind of riling it up, getting people to kind of, do things they might not otherwise do. If you're looking at federal investigation level, agent provocateurs will often provide individuals with weapons. People say like, oh, I really wanted to, I'm thinking of a famous case, and someone said, yeah, I really want to blow up that dam, but I guess I can't because I don't have access to explosives. And this person who happens to be an FBI agent comes out and says like, well, I know how to get explosives, right? That's what we kind of mean by agent provocateurs. We also have infiltration, people who penetrate movements and organizations under false pretenses. We have police engaging in direct violence, arrest, prosecution, and obviously incarceration. So there's a whole range of what we think of in terms of policing, even though we often think of it just as the cop in the street who's going to put you in handcuffs. Sure, that's part of it, but that's a pretty small part of it. That's kind of this part of it, right? This is just to show the very obvious point, which is that policing has radically changed and will continue to radically change. Not only does it change the tools they have access to, the militarization of the tools, but what we kind of get used to, right? In the 1968 Democratic National Convention was very violent by all standards. If you don't know what the days of rage are, that's something that's totally worth searching and looking at. But to imagine in 2020, people coming for peaceable marches, even peaceable marches where property is not damaged, and the police preemptively show up looking like this, right? And this is a 10-year-old cartoon. It is certainly something we have to contend with. Again, I'm not going to tell anyone something they don't know, in that police are overly militarized. But coming with that militarization is also a style of thinking, a way of acting. So it's not just that they look scarier and have better tools, it's that how they actually police has changed. So for one thing, for example, we have multi-jurisdictional cooperation. So in a lot of the arrests, what we're seeing from the current George Floyd protests, we have people who are arrested days, weeks, or in some cases months after a demonstration, and they're arrested at their home by, for example, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the ATF. That's not typical. The case which kind of ignited the Green Scare, which is known as Operation Backfire, this occurred in 2005. The Operation Backfire case, when we look at the jurisdictions, we see that intelligence was provided from something as small as like Eugene, Oregon University Police, all the way up to probably the National Security Agency, which is prevented by law from spying on Americans, but nonetheless. And so we need to understand that policing is changing, but changing not just in the costume, right? We have increased militarization, we have multi-jurisdictional cooperation, we have cooperation between police and, again, far-right militia. We saw this in the J20 case, where so-called oath keepers, these are, again, self-appointed militia members, were actually physically detaining people and then handing them over to police. This changes our threat model. When we talk about what is the threat, this changes it, because the threat of who is the hostile actor has changed over time. When we look at intelligence, we look at different things. Now, intelligence is very different. Intelligence is broadly. Think about it as a vacuum cleaner that sucks up as much information as possible, puts it together in a somewhat understandable way, and puts it aside on the shelf, creating massive libraries, right? Don't think of it in the way in which people see, if you watch shows like 24 or CSI or things like that, where everything's kind of, a bomb's always about to go off and everyone's rushing. Sure, that occurs, but that's not really what we're talking about. When I'm talking about intelligence, I'm talking about your day-to-day everything being sucked up by a massive vacuum cleaner and put on a shelf to be used later for an event we haven't yet known about. This quote I like in the middle is from a person named Bruce Schneier. I can spell his name. I believe it's Schneier, from a book he wrote called Click Here to Kill Everybody. Bruce Schneier is one of the most amazing security theorists out there. If you want to jump into something, he's where it's at. But anyway, he says, quote, "Our data used to be thrown away because the value of it was so marginal and using it was so difficult. These days are over. Today, data storage is so cheap that all this data can be saved. This is the raw material that has become big data. It's fundamentally surveillance data, and it's being collected and used by corporations primarily to support the advertising model that underpins much of the internet. So what do they mean? Well, every single place your phone has ever been, right? Every single cell tower your phone has ever been, which basically means every single place you've ever been. Every single phone number you've ever called, how long you've talked to them. Every single email you've ever sent and who that went to and the content of it, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea is we don't wait until Johnny, commits a crime and then go through Johnny's email. The idea with intelligence gathering is if we can just suck up all email, then after Johnny commits a crime, we can just type his name in and find all of his stuff. And so who's doing that? Well, if you're in the US, if you're in the US, okay, let me say it this way. If you're in the US and you're a US citizen and the only people you're talking to are US citizens, the entity doing that is the FBI, okay? The National Security Agency, which is in the middle, is a fundamentally different beast. The NSA is the only part of our federal government which has an undisclosed budget, a so-called black budget. So we don't know how much they spend. We do know that they're the largest purchaser of computer hardware in the world, not of US government agencies, but the largest purchaser of computer hardware. We also know that they're the largest employer of mathematicians. And if that doesn't make any sense to you, it's because all cryptography, right, all encryption is based in math. So basically what the NSA's job is to suck up all forms of communication that enter or leave the US and to decipher them. Now, again, you might say, well, I only work with people in the US, which is probably unlikely anyway. But even if you do, and this is a complicated point, but basically when you send an email from, let's say, New York to New Jersey, right? It may travel 30 miles, but to send that email, it might go out of the United States, right? Your email could travel from New York to, let's say, a data server in Singapore, and then from Singapore into the next US destination. In that case, it then becomes the purview of the NSA. So most of our internet traffic, the NSA can observe because most of it does cross the US border. And again, the government breaks the law all the time. So even if putting that aside. On the bottom, excuse me, I have some examples of other entities which are not often considered. These are all private entities, right? They're not governmental entities, and they range. I actually like the work that START does, the National Consortium for the Study and Responses of Terrorism. They're a data science, they're based at the University of Maryland, and they basically, have some troubling conclusions, but they, show their work. They're very transparent. They're data centric. I like them. I think they do good work. Some of the other ones, Flashpoint, Stratfor, and Cite, these are for-profit corporations, which are typically made up of ex-FBI, ex-CIA people. And they, they produce intelligence reports and then sell them to the government. Flashpoint particularly, and Cite, are really interested in leftists. Flashpoint has authored numerous reports that I've seen my own name in, as well as lots of people we know and work with. Cite as well. You won't be able to get most of that information unless you pay them lots of money. But those are things we need to consider. The one in the upper right is the RCMP, the Canadian Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Okay, so this is something that's kind of new, right? These images are taken from the last couple of weeks, but we have an emerging threat, which is basically crowdsourcing what we call open source intelligence, right? This kind of funnel approach. So what we know is that after a demonstration, what the government does is they just open the funnel, right? They collect all social media, right? Every video posted to Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, they just suck all that up. And regardless of your privacy settings, they suck it up because they can get it directly from the host, right? They can get it from Facebook, even if it's a private post. They get all news media footage. They get police video and body cam footage. They get, obviously closed circuit TV, the cameras on light poles and banks and ATMs and things like that. And then they just lay those all out and they slowly go through them, right? And they find people. This is why people are being arrested weeks after. What we also see is that they're crowdsourcing this information. They're saying, hey, here's this person. Who are they? And again, I have hundreds of examples of this just from the past couple of weeks. And so this leads to a lot of things we need to do, right? Protect our anonymity and responsibly collect this information. And I can look at this towards the end of how I would suggest you do that. But this is an example of how the intelligence these folks collect are used in meaningful ways. The other thing we see occurring a lot is what's called social network analysis. And this is basically the government mapping us, right? Mapping our networks. I don't mean to sound rude or dismissive, but if you use Facebook, you're doing this work for the government. I've never used Facebook. I find it really like a very antithetical to any notion of privacy, because you're basically saying who you know, how well you know them, and how frequently you talk to them. You're doing that work for some entity, and to think that the government can't get access to that is I'm sorry, quite silly. I can show you, the subpoenas. They're quite easy. And so what we see on the right is an actual social network analysis map that was leaked by the government. This is looking at protesters and journalists on the US-Mexico border. And you can see the way they're doing this. It's redacted for obvious reasons. We also have a case somewhat recently, which the affidavit really gives us a lot of information. This is Blumenthal, her name is. She was a demonstrator arrested in Philadelphia. And again, long story short is that the police found out who she was by finding the shirt she was wearing on Etsy and going back through the comments on Etsy and tracing that back to her LinkedIn profile. My point is that all they needed was that first image, and they didn't have that image until they looked through everyone's Facebook video, and then they did. The other thing, which is if people want to explore this on their own, kind of what social network analysis is, right, how this mapping works, there's a very useful, and I would argue pretty simple to use piece of software called Maltego, M-A-L-T-E-G-O, and specifically Maltego or Maltego's CE, which I believe means Community Edition, is free. That's what the diagram on the left was produced with, this bunch of dots. And this is the first time I ever used it. This was kind of the one I produced. The brown dot, I'm trying to get my pointer back. I lost it. Where's my pointer? There we go. This brown dot is my name. This blue dot was my old phone number, right? The old phone number led to this brown dot, which led to all these other things. This was an email address, which I'd only been using for about 6 months. And you can see how that links. And so what this is a pretty automated way for you to put in information on a target or yourself and to see what records are available. But you can see with only starting with a name or a phone number or an email address, how many different records I was able to locate. And each one of these represents a website or a social media account or a post somewhere, et cetera, et cetera. If I can do this with free software in 5 minutes, to think what the FBI can do is quite intimidating. So one of the things we're talking about is that intelligence is both how police investigate crime, right? Someone set fire to this police car. We're going to figure out who did it. Sure, fine. But what we're really talking about, what I'm trying to, in a sense, prepare you to challenge is something that's occurring outside of the investigation of a particular crime. Something that's ongoing, something that's always being collected, always being stored, always being remixed, right? Always being re-examined, right? This information is not going anywhere. It's standing on a shelf. So not necessarily, solving particular crimes, but mapping who we are and what we do is sort of the intelligence platform that really concerns me. Okay, we'll loop back to this a little bit towards the end with strategies. The third area is psychology. Again, I'm not a psychologist, but this should be something we should keep in mind. Fear and stress are normal, right? The word normal is, I know, kind of problematic, but fear and stress are normal. Fear and stress are normal reactions to stimuli, right? Things happen. We are fearful of them. That's okay, right? If a wolf walks in front of my house and, bares its teeth at me, I'm going to be fearful of that. That's smart. I should be fearful of that. That thing could kill me, right? I have a lot of demanding deadlines. That's going to cause stress. That's fine. Like that's a normal and healthy response. The question is, what do fear and stress lead to? Depending on you, your psychology, your chemical physiology, and the situations around you, it could lead to depression, anxiety, rage, cognitive dysfunction, right? You can't think clearly, you can't do things well. And what we often don't think about, which is atypical morality, right? In other words, you would do things which you wouldn't normally do, right? You're the kind of person that has "Stop Snitching" tattooed across their chest. Well, if you're under a high degree of fear and stress and you're arrested and the police say, who gave you that Molotov? You could have atypical, right, not typical morality. You could say, oh, it was Johnny, because you're really stressed and fearful. So when people are under fear and stress, they behave in ways which, are counter to their ethics or their politics. And to state the obvious, fear and stress can lead to damage to your physical health, right? Everything from headaches to back pain to all sorts of things. And what is the result of those things? Well, inactivity, right? You don't want to do anything, burnout, and trauma, right? Long-term trauma. And so when we look at the effects of fear and stress, right, we see that it does a lot of things. One is it disrupts our movements, right? People pull out for times, sometimes long times. People become suspicious of one another, right? Now, again, a healthy degree of suspicion is important, right? A lot of my work deals with suspicion. But, you know, people assuming that everyone is in it for the wrong reasons, right? That's one of the effects of this, and this is intentional. I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but I did a 2-year investigation a couple years ago looking at police and how they were basically very intentionally getting into activist networks by male police finding female activists and befriending them and then dating them and then having sex with them and then in some cases marrying them and in some cases having children with them. And then once they were in a sexual relationship with, you know, once the police was in a sexual relationship with the person they were spying on, they could basically be like, well, of course I'm not a cop. I'm Jane's boyfriend. You all know me. And so using sexual trust as a way to get legitimacy, I would argue had 2 effects, right? One is it got them good information, but the other thing is it really fucked with people's abilities to trust one another, right? It sowed suspicion throughout our entire movements. So now people had to look at even intimate partners to determine if that person was who they said they were. So I would say that the state wasn't like, oh no, we got caught. I think that the state was okay being caught because they know that once demonstrators realize that police are sleeping with activists to gain their trust, that everyone becomes less trustful. And that is one of the goals of intelligence gathering. This is what I would call loss of community, right? No one trusts each other anymore. The other thing we have is what's called snitch jacketing, which is when people accuse each other of being cops, right? You're a cop, you're a cop. You know, Johnny's not talking a lot today. He must be a cop. Or like, we all went to this action and Jane was missing, so Jane must be a cop, right? That's snitch jacketing. And the results are all the same, right? We're less effective, we're tired, we're sad, we're angry, right? We lose trust, we lose money, all those kind of things. This is the area I want to talk about the least because I think I'm the least qualified to talk about it, but it needs to be mentioned. And so the last area I want to talk about is discourse. Now, discourse is again, a challenging word, but discourse basically means the limits through which how we can discuss a particular topic, okay? So, you know, what is Trump's discourse on the early stages of the rioting? Well, you can see it right here in this tweet. They're all foreign agitators, right? They're anarchists, they're not locals. They're, you know, the implication is that they're white people in non-white areas, that they're non-locals, et cetera, et cetera. That's an example of a discourse. You'll see that he obviously had to quickly walk back because it was totally fundamentally false. So the discourses and rhetorics are developed in a lot of different places, right? The media is where we most often see them, but we can also talk about the courts. I'll show you an interesting one in a second, but also in academia and, you know, general conversations. You know, think about like what's said around the dinner table, as well as, you know, within security services. And there's lots of narratives and discourses that we're familiar with. This is just from the last, you know, couple of months of protests, right? We have the good protester, bad protester discourse. The like, there are some demonstrators who are here just to cause problems and capitalize on confusion to sow disorder, right? That's the bad protester. And the good protester is the person that's like agreeable and can kind of be patted on the head and won't mess with you. We also have the discourse of constructive and destructive, right? There are some people here who came just to break things, that notion. Same thing with agreeable oppositional. We have a discourse which Trump is using a lot now about outside agitators. The idea that people come in from another place to like make your protest. As a side note, the outside, and I've said this before, but the outside agitator discourse is, it's one of those rare things which has the uniqueness of being virulently anti-Black and racist, as well as anti-Semitic at the same time. If you look into this further, the kind of outside agitator narrative is basically that white Jews control Blacks in social action because the Black demonstrators aren't politically aware enough to be angry, and that they need these kind of outside troublemakers who are typically cast as Jews and communists to kind of get people riled up. Now, again, Trump's not going to be that as explicit, but if you look at his tweets and the tweets of the Attorney General, that discourse is very plainly there. Yeah. We also have what we sometimes call both sidism, right? The idea that, like, you know, and Trump very famously said this after the Charlottesville murder. You know, he said, you know, there's quote, good people on both sides, saying that, you know, yeah. So these are the discourses we have to kind of contend with. And what they lead to is repression through both our own means, right, internally, as well as external means. So for example, inter-movement factionalization, right, where one group's like, where one chapter of Black Lives Matter calls out the other one for breaking the law, right? This is inter-movement factionalism. We also have this notion of, outrunning the bear, right? This is the notion of you don't have, there's a famous phrase that says, you don't have to outrun the bear, you just have to outrun your friend, right? And this is the idea that like, you don't have to be like the best protester, you just can't be the worst, right? So in Trump's rhetoric, you can't be the anarchists. As long as you're not the violent anarchists, then like, it's fine. And we can just like leave all of our repression there. And then who is a violent anarchist is just an overly expanding definition. The other thing we have, and I realize I'm going backwards in this, is we have selective facilitation. Selective facilitation is when the state basically picks a good guy and a bad guy and helps the good guy and hurts the bad guy. So you have two different demonstrations, right? You have the People for Tolerance and Peace demonstration, and you have the militantly against white supremacy demonstration, right? So the state gives the first group a permit and a bunch of, porta potties, and the second group they just throw tear gas at. That's selective facilitation. It pits movement against movement. The examples of this are so many, it's impossible to even scratch the surface, but here's a few. If you want to dig into a document, and again, like I said, a lot of my work is dealing with people investigating far right, which is why most of these examples are from anti-fascist groups. But this Antifa, anti-Antifa fighting in the streets report is, it's the kind of thing that you really wonder how this stuff gets published. But this was a report given to the United States government by an institution. It makes this case very well. It basically says that anti-fascists and fascists are two sides of the same coin. It denies the reality that anti-fascists respond to the actions of fascists. Right? Just to be clear, anti-fascism is not required if fascism does not exist. So if there weren't fascist assemblies, demonstrations, there would be no anti-fascism. What this report does is subvert that logic and say basically that anti-fascists are going around looking for fascists to fight. It's a very bizarre report, but it really underscores this kind of discourse. If you want other examples, right, look at Trump's tweets, look at the word anarchist, look at the word Antifa, any of those words he likes to use. If you want a really boring example, but is really interesting from like a couple days ago, the lovely Ted Cruz, as you can see down here, maskless in his seat, he chaired a multi-hour meeting. You can see it's 3.5 hours, a multi-hour meeting called "The Right of the People Peaceably to Assemble, Protecting Speech by Stopping Anarchist Violence." Basically, the point of this hearing is to say that everyone demonstrating in Portland is an anarchist, and everyone demonstrating in Portland is counter to the cause of Black Lives Matter. That's basically I just saved you 3.5 hours. It's really worth watching, as bizarre as that sounds. It's available online. I guess it's called C-SPAN. But it's such a clear example of attempting to set the discourse. Let me give you a couple more examples, and then we'll jump into something a little bit different. So for one is that the discourse of like who is dangerous is also really interesting. These are both leaked documents that were leaked in late 2019. If you want to see more information on this, you can look up what's called the Iron Fist program. The Iron Fist program is targeting one of my least favorite terms the government has made up called Black identity extremists. Black identity extremists don't exist. They're not a thing, but it's a thing that the government loves to say. You can see that they're considered a big threat here. What you can notice on the left-hand column is that most of this information is redacted. But what I want to draw your attention to is if you look on the right, what we have going forward, so looking at the fiscal year 2020, which we're currently in, the government identifies racially motivated violent extremism as a primary concern. And a lot of people like myself are like, yeah, cool. We've been saying, white supremacists are a growing threat for 20 years. Glad you're looking at racially motivated violent extremists. But then you look at the definition of racially motivated violent extremists. I don't mean to laugh because it's really not funny, but it's defined here. I just pasted this in. Racially motivated violent extremists use force or violence in violation of criminal law, and here's the real key part, in response to perceived racism and injustice in American society. So just to be clear, racially motivated violent extremism is Black Lives Matter, right? Because they work in they work in response to perceived racism and injustice in American society. So this is not actually what we were looking for, asking for. But again, this is the discourse. The discourse is, yes, we're focused on racially motivated violent extremists. And most people hear that, they're like, oh, cool, finally, you're taking this white supremacist stuff seriously. And you can see that they do list white supremacy extremists separately. Yeah, so this is just another example of the government trying to make discourse, trying to establish discourse. The other thing, if you want more examples of this, is every year, every state puts out a terrorism threat assessment. New Jersey's are particularly terrible if you want to look at some bad examples. But you can see on the right, this is their assessment level, high, moderate, and low. Again, the idea that anarchists are a moderate threat to the United States, to me is a claim that needs to be interrogated quite large, especially when we have transnational terrorists on the actual low side. So again, I'm just kind of showing you this. Yeah, there's a lot we can say here. Okay, so I want to pause and I want to shift. What I've tried to do, and I only went 7 minutes longer than I thought I would, but what I tried to do is show you how to think about repression, right? What are the ways in which repression operates? How does it operate? And through what means can we really understand it? What I want to do now is shift your thinking to say, okay, now I understand a bit, but how do I actually understand what's relevant to me, right? You know, I'm involved in X campaign, X group, this is what I do. How does this apply to me? Okay, so what I hope people can take from a talk like this is figuring out what they need to secure and what they don't need to secure. Just to put it out there as a point, over securing less risky things makes your security practices bad, right? Again, if, you know, think of school, assuming you went to a school. Let's say every day you have a fire drill, okay? And then on the 366th day, after you've had 365 fire drills, there's a fire. You're probably gonna be pretty good at getting out of the building, but you also might be like, it's just another drill, and then you burn to death, right? So over securing certain things makes people desensitive to security. And under securing, not providing enough security, opens people up to risk. So you need to think through the threat you're facing, not just the best tools to secure it. If that makes sense. And again, if you're trying to like, what the hell is this guy talking about? Threat modeling is something you do all the time. You threat model constantly. And again, depending on your age, your race, your sexuality, your gender, your physical ability, your citizenship status, your physical size, you're gonna do this all the time, right? When you are walking home from a concert, a bar, and it's nighttime, you constantly threat model. You say, well, I can save 10 minutes by walking through this park, but I might get murdered, so I won't. Or, you know, I could take the bus, but, you know, I don't have money or whatever. You're constantly doing this, right? If you think about, you live with your parents, right? And you're gonna sneak out at night. You're gonna go to a movie. You threat model. You figure out what are the risks, right? How likely are my parents gonna hear me, right? What are the security systems we have, right? How likely, you know, and more importantly, like, what are the consequences, right? Is it gonna be a big deal if I get caught? And again, if that's too abstract, think about driving, speeding, right? Speeding is a threat, is an act of threat modeling. You're constantly evaluating the police, your risk of getting pulled over. You're constantly evaluating the weather. Depending on where you live like where I live, you're evaluating the risk of deer running into the road, right? That's a threat model, right? It's a process, as it says here, by which potential threats and structural vulnerabilities can be identified, typically from the attacker's point of view. And you start by thinking through these things. You know, who are you? What you're working on? What could go wrong? You know, what is the thing we're trying to do? And did we do a good job at it? Edward Snowden, the famous NSA leaker, described threat modeling, and I like this, as raising the shields and lowering the target surface, right? You raise the shields, you put up your defenses, and you lower the target surface, right? You lower what people can know about you. And this is what I want to focus on. So here's a basic threat model, right? What is the threat? Well, what you probably don't know is that the vase, this ugly ass brown vase here, is worth over $10 million. It is a $10.1 million vase from the Ming Dynasty that's owned by Steve Wynn, who's a casino tycoon. Okay, and so you have this $10 million vase in your house right there. and you want to protect them from theft, okay? And so before you start picking tools at random, you kind of need to understand the threat you're facing. Why? Well, because my daughter animated this, if you're enjoying the animations. So we buy this lock. This is a $10,000 lock. As a side note, for anyone who likes lock picking, these locks are probably the easiest locks to pick. So if you want to learn lock picking, get this exact kind of lock and you can learn to pick locks. But let's assume that's a really nice high security $10,000 lock, okay? We buy that lock, boom. Then we install this big old machine gun, which is, just to be clear, an illegal military grade weapon. But we install this big old machine gun on the top of our house. And whenever someone touches the lock, right? When someone jiggles the lock, this machine gun just shoots them, okay? So no one's getting in this door. We also install 3 security cameras, right? And what do these security cameras do? Well, they film you, right? In the day, in the night, they're gonna take a picture of you. They don't do anything else, but they're gonna film you, okay? This is a pretty well secured house, right? Anytime someone goes on the roof or in the front door or on the side door, they're gonna get photographed by this camera. If they come to touch this lock, they're gonna get shot by this, this gun. But this is a good example of the way in which a lot of us think about security. All of this security doesn't stop this, right? This severed hand with the hammer, right? If what I want to do is steal the vase, if my threat model is protecting my vase from being stolen, then all I do is I run up, I don't go to this door because Lord doesn't want to be shot by this gun, but I go to this big old window and I smash the window, I take the vase and I leave. Now, I'm not going to be hit by the gun. The lock doesn't affect me at all because I'm on a totally different side of the house. Sure, this camera might see me, but that's actually not a problem, right? My goal wasn't to steal the vase invisibly. My goal is just to steal it, right? Obviously, there's ways I can conceal my identity. So even though I have some security mechanisms, they don't actually mitigate the threat at all. They actually don't prevent my vase from being stolen at all. And to say nothing of the smash and grab, right? What about the Santa Claus attack, right? What about someone coming through an access point, which is not this door? I put this here because it was easy to do, but what about this window right here, right? What about someone leaning a ladder against the house and climbing in this window, right? For that sake, if you're real risky, what about someone leaning up a ladder and going in this window, right? So the presence of the lock, the presence of the gun, the presence of the cameras does not protect us. So think of the lock as signal, right? Think of the gun as your VPN, right? Think of the cameras as whatever other security programs you use. They're great tools, but if you don't use them in the correct ecosystem, then they have no purpose. Oops. Okay, so how do I understand your threat model? Again, in a sense, you kind of model the system, right? You model what you're doing, you find the threats in it, you address those threats, and then you figure out if what you did actually worked. There are more or less infinite threats, but I think for organizers and activists, we're talking about 5 main threats. Disruption, especially in this Zoom world we live in now. A lot of us, that's a big threat we're risking. Like who's going to disrupt our webinar or things like that. We also have obviously people disrupting in real life meetings. Fascist groups like Patriot Front have been really big on trying to disrupt, gatherings of leftists. We also have observation, right? It's a totally different threat. Is someone able to surveil you, to hear what you're doing, right? They don't necessarily need to disrupt it, but maybe they're just trying to hear it, right? For prosecution or for a lawsuit or whatever. We also have exposure, right? That's a big threat, figuring out who's doing what, right? I'm a public, myself speaking, I'm a public organizer, right? I do most of this kind of work under my real name. I do a fair bit of work under other names, right? But this is, in a sense, like there's no risk of exposure for me doing this as a security trainer. So some people that's true for, some people it's not true for, right? What we found is that, for example, far right groups are very prone to exposure, right? They don't like being exposed. We also have the threat of infiltration, right? Of people getting into our networks, again, being something other than what they said who they are. And we have the challenge of exfiltration, or what we commonly call theft, right? People taking things, right? And there's all sorts of things people can take. Disruption, observation, exposure, infiltration, and theft, right? Those are 5 different threats. You might be facing all of them. You might be facing none of them, right? But you need to first begin by understanding what is the threat, right?
If you're an organizer, a public organizer, right, holding a megaphone in the middle of the street, hiding your identity is not important, right? Exposure in that sense is not important. Sure, you might not want your home address released or pictures of your kids, sure, but generally hiding your identity is not important. But where you live might be something you want to protect. Whom you're associated with might be something you want to protect. Who your employer is might be something you want to protect. In other settings, you might not want to be identified, right? So when some of these risks come up and other ones do is a really big part, right? So when I'm at risk for exposure is different than when I'm at risk for infiltration. This is basically how you do this. Just to back up a second, the first slide I had that thing, that Keybase address where I have these slides. In that Keybase site, there's a folder called threat modeling. In that folder called threat modeling are a number of worksheets in which you can go through these as activities. If you take nothing away from this, do a threat model activity. It's really interesting. You can learn a lot about who you are and what work you're doing. So this is basically me kind of giving a quick overview of how you do that. So as you do a threat model, and as the worksheet will show you, you think like an attacker, right? What am I trying to protect, right? What are the risks, right? Who am I protecting it from and what are they capable of? Again, sneaking out of prison and sneaking out of your parents' house are different. Why? Because your opponent has different capabilities, right? Your opponent has different levels of skill and the consequences are different, right? Number three, how likely do you need to protect that, right? Are you being attacked every day, right? If you have a website, and it's being, there's failed logins every day, that's different than you have a website that no one's ever heard of. So, what is your level of exposure and how bad are the consequences? Are you going to get in trouble? Are you going to get arrested? Are you going to get sued? Are you going to get deported? Are you going to face serious criminal charges? Right? Those are different levels of risk. And then again, what defenses are suitable? There are defenses that are really good. You want the police not to track your phone. Every single time you're not making a phone call, you put your phone in what we call a Faraday bag, a bag which prevents radio transmissions. But you're not going to get text messages while you're out, right? So a lot of trouble, very high security, right? So you need to balance that. And so what is the balance of that for you and your group? This is the whole question of a threat model. And you can't answer these, I feel like I've said this a lot, but I'll say it again. You can't answer these questions in a vacuum, right? These have to be answered in your world which is informed by things like race, class, age, etc. Okay, so what are specific kind of threat models we can look at? Well, again, on the far left, let's say someone's eavesdropping, right? That's what we're really worried about. That's not specific enough, clearly, right? Is your roommate reading your journal? Okay, put a lock on your journal, right? Like hide your journal somewhere high. Maybe your neighbor is searching your garbage, right? This is something that we do whenever we investigate people. Well, okay, you can fix that. Shred your garbage, burn your garbage. I don't care, right? Don't throw it out. Put it out right before they're going to get picked up. Let's say trolls are joining your Facebook group. Okay, you can lock that down and you can have privacy settings. What about local police? Overt surveillance. Overt surveillance means surveillance that they want you to see. Police are sitting across the street from your meetings, sitting in their car with a long-range camera. Well, if you look at how some of the Confederate monuments are taken down in wow, what is that place called? North Carolina, Chapel Hill. In Chapel Hill, when people took down the monuments, they surrounded the monument in a giant sheet, so you couldn't see what people were doing behind it. So yeah, there's certainly ways to block the police from looking into your house. What about the FBI's passive surveillance? Think of them tailing you or putting in listening devices. Well, there's ways around that. At some point, you get to the point where usability and security are off balance. And I don't know where that is for you. We have what's called the man in the middle attack, which is, I won't go into what it's explaining. You can Google it and learn for yourself. Once you get to the point of FBI passive surveillance and man in the middle attacks, your usability is going to go radically down and your security is going to go radically high. Okay, so again, figuring out how to balance that is the key, not necessarily which tools to use. So if you see in the middle column, I have basically 5 scenarios, and I'm identifying what I would think the biggest threats are. Right, you're hosting a Zoom meeting for the general public. The threat's disruption, right? Let's say you're hosting a Zoom meeting within your network, within your affinity group. Well, then the threat is observation. It's not disruption, right? It's not open to the public, so no one's going to disrupt it. but the threat is someone recording that and using it in court. Let's say you're hosting a semi-public Zoom meeting to plan a series of actions, right? You put up flyers, say, we're shutting down, the Capitol, Capitol Street tomorrow, everyone come on the Zoom meeting, right? The threat of that is probably exposure and infiltration, exposure of the organizers, infiltration of the meeting. Or let's say you have a secret, right? Let's say you have documents which show the police are engaging in something nefarious, right? Then your threats are probably observation, right? People knowing who you are, people seeing what you're doing, and someone stealing it. So again, if you look at different threat models on the right, can I host a conference on Zoom? Let's say what we're doing right now. Can I host this on Zoom? In my assessment, yeah, you can. Because the threat model is really observation, right? Am I worried about the FBI seeing this? No, because I'm not saying anything it's illegal. I'm saying things I would say in court. Nothing here is challenging in that sense. So yeah, I think it's totally fine within your threat model to host your thing on Zoom. But let's say you're planning a bunch of highway blockades or any sort of illegal street action, right? Can I store and do that on Google Maps? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. It's fundamentally outside your threat model, because if you're arrested, and assumingly you will be, the government is going to seize your records. The government is going to subpoena your electronic records. And the first thing they're going to do is subpoena your Apple iCloud, your email, anything like that. And so all of that information is going to be made accessible to them. Yes, it was encrypted in transit, but if Google gives it to the US attorney, it's not encrypted anymore. And so, and I'll go into that in a few slides, but that is an example of two different threat models, which are really, really different. And there's a lot of different ways in which this plays out, right? Something I like to remind people is that private citizens are not bound by the Fourth Amendment. In other words, there is no illegal search in private citizens. The Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution prevents the government, right, the police, from doing undue searches. It doesn't prevent your roommate from doing undue searches. They're not bound by that. It doesn't prevent some neo-Nazi from breaking into your house and doing undue searches, right? So again, saying, well, the law protects me from searches without a warrant, no, it doesn't. It prevents the police from searching without a warrant to some degree. But again, your roommate or your ex-boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever, stealing all your secrets and exposing you, that's outside your threat model. Right? If you think all the way back to that first slide about the blown up phone and the drunk text, right? Those are things outside of our threat model. Well, what's usually outside of people's threat models in my experience is people they've slept with and who were angry at them. I have received a lot of information, specifically on neo-Nazis, from people that used to sleep with them, who don't like them anymore for whatever reason. They're like, here's a bunch of personal information on them, right? That's probably outside of most of our threat models, because most of our intimate partners have access to that stuff. I'm not going to go through this, but this is the classic way people teach threat modeling. They use the Bruce Wayne Batman threat model. So I'm just putting this out here. Take a look at it in your spare time. Think through if you can work through this, right? This is what a threat model looks like. What are the different threats that are presented by police, the Joker, and journalists? What are the different defense mechanisms, security system, hiding your location or encryption, right? What are the things that Batman's trying to protect? His cave, his assistant, his emails, and his text messages. So this shows you how you can do a threat model of something that we're all meant to understand. The idea with this exercise is that we're all meant to know who Batman is. Okay, the question I usually always get at this point is, well, all this being said, should I use Zoom? Basically, I think it depends. Zoom sucks. We're using it right now. I use it all the time. Zoom sucks. Why does it suck? They collect and store your personal data. They're pretty open about this. They sell that information to companies for advertising revenue. They've worked with the Chinese government to censor pro-human rights demonstrators and some other things like that. They've also lied repeatedly about the use of their encryption. They misrepresented it when everyone started using Zoom at the beginning of the pandemic. Then in May of 2020, in response to all this criticism, they bought one of my favorite companies, a company called Keybase, which does amazing encryption work. And then a month later, due to lots of criticism, they began offering end-to-end encryption. So as of now, all Zoom calls should be end-to-end encrypted if they're set up correctly. That being said, I still don't trust them for a lot of reasons. But again, what is the threat you're facing? If what you're trying to prevent is live monitoring, if you're trying to prevent someone from recording what you say and keeping it to sue you later, don't use Zoom, right? If you're trying to use Zoom as a way to have a semi-public exchange like we're having right now, I think it's fine. It's not great for keeping unwanted people out, but there are lots of ways you can make it better. So what I'm saying here, for example, the way I do it is Zoom plus a very customized set of settings, which I can show you, and having this login information distributed through a secure channel, such as Keybase or Signal, that equals, I think, pretty good security. Not amazing, but pretty good security, right? And this is what we call a workflow. Most of the work that I do in my like consulting world is I help people set these up. They say, I want to do X or Y, and I want to do it securely. And I say, okay, let's figure out the best, do it here. I give them the tools in the right order. That's basically what we're talking about here. This is basically a workflow. Let me skip that. So threat modeling in this way that I'm talking about, it should be understood in the following. Threat modeling, which is what we're talking about, understanding the risks that you face, combined with harm reduction, which people should be familiar with harm reduction, people who work with in public health or other areas. And again, the idea with harm reduction is that the world is dangerous. We need to accept that the world is dangerous, right? When I get into a car, I have to accept that that car can kill me pretty easily and kill others. But I accept that risk. But I work in a harm reduction way. I try to be in a car which is relatively safe. I wear my seatbelt when it's available. I don't consume alcohol when I'm driving, whatever it is that I do to reduce the harm. That doesn't mean the car is safe, but that means that I've accepted some of the risk and I've worked to minimize other harmful effects. And so if you think of threat modeling as a form of harm reduction, then it can lead to a culture of security, right? A culture in which we engage in certain practices of security. And I want to go through those pretty briefly and then spend the last bit on questions. I'm going to speed this up a little bit. So again, one of the things that often comes up is virtual private networks. This is a big thing. Again, without going into too much detail, a virtual private network is something everyone should use. What it basically means is that your connection to the internet has a filter where your data is encrypted. So in this idea right here, there's no VPN. Here's my laptop, and I'm communicating with my internet service provider, let's say Verizon, and then Verizon is sending my requests to the internet and vice versa. What that means is that if the government seizes Verizon's records legally, they can get all of the information that I've ever sent to the internet, every Google search and everything. A VPN puts something else in there, right? I communicate to my VPN. The VPN communicates to the internet service provider, right? Verizon. The internet service provider then relays the information through the VPN. The idea is that this connection, right, is encrypted, and depending on which VPN you use, often protected by laws. A lot of VPNs are based in Germany and Switzerland, which have very good data privacy laws. In other words, if the US government seizes that VPN's information, they don't have the information that they need. In a sense, my general strategy when doing these things is not to secure information that I've created, but to prevent creating information I need to secure. Let me say that one more time. The purpose of using a VPN, the purpose of using Signal, the purpose of using other things like that is that instead of creating all this stuff, which then you have to protect, think of it a different way. How do I communicate with people, send emails, send text messages, have phone calls, surf the internet without creating those little nuggets, which I then have to protect? Using a VPN is one of those steps. The other one people tend to use is Tor. There's so much information online about what Tor is. I don't want to spend time doing it, but this is basically how Tor is. It basically is a way of bouncing your traffic through a number of encrypted relays so that
Hey,
we can,
Michael,
yep.
we got a question. It says, Google phones come with a Google VPN. Is that trustworthy, or should I use a separate one?
Okay, perfect. Let me skip right into the next thing. So my short answer is no, it's not trustworthy. It's trustworthy in a sense. So let me work through this diagram right here. If you look on the right, Google, as a mainstream service provider, maintains what we call, and I don't want to get too technical, but maintains what we call transportation level security, TLS. What that means is that when your information, so this is how it's always Alice and Bob, if you ever see stuff about encryption. So when Alice sends information to Bob, Alice sends it from her her laptop to the mail provider, right? That's a secured connection. So this is Google right here, right? And that's an encrypted connection. It's also so in a sense, when the information is sent to the server, no one's going to steal it. But when it sits on Google's server, it's not encrypted. Why? Well, because Google needs access to it. They're going to mine it for advertising information, for one. And for two, they need to be able to give it to the government if they need. So what we have here is a system where if Google is holding your information, whether it's a voice over IP number or it's it's actual emails or files or whatever, it's unlikely a hacker is going to steal those en route. But it is likely that the United States Attorney's Office is going to get full access to that if they're asked to do so. So I would always advocate people using what we call zero knowledge systems. Basically, a zero knowledge system means that the person holding your records can't see them, right? So not only is the information encrypted in transit, but the information is encrypted at rest, right? While it's on the server, it's also encrypted. So these are companies that offer it, for example. If pCloud is subpoenaed by the US government, pCloud can only deliver encrypted data. pCloud does not maintain unencrypted copies of your data. You sure as hell better believe that iCloud and Google Cloud do, and Dropbox and all the other ones. So I would never use Google products for security if that security potentially breaks the law. It's good security protecting you from hackers. It's good security protecting you from like your roommate. It's not good security from someone with a search warrant because Google will comply with that search warrant, if that makes sense. So that's basically what this whole slide's about, is that oftentimes we use cloud services without remembering, right? Like our phones are set up to automatically upload to say Dropbox or iCloud. So if your phone is really well secured and Dropbox and iCloud are not well secured, nothing you do on your phone matters, right? If the government wants your data, they're just going to subpoena it. The last time I was arrested and charged with a serious crime, within 2 days, I had subpoenas from Twitter, Facebook, and I don't even use Facebook, but Facebook, Twitter, Facebook, and Google. And they seized all the information on my iCloud, which is mostly photographs, all the information from my Gmail, which was like 3 different email accounts I use for work, and anything that was associated with my phone number, which was a Facebook account for my employer and a couple Twitter accounts, including some like sock accounts, which were hard to explain. But nonetheless, the idea here is that, again, you don't want to create information that has to be secured. You want to create information that's held in an environment in which it can't be released. This is why I like some of these systems, sync.com, pCloud. These are really good systems because, again, the idea is that they can't turn over the information because the information they have but cannot access. So they can only deliver encrypted information. So I would never use Google for security. And if you look again on that Keybase folder I provided, in that folder is a folder called White Papers, which goes through the back end security of Google, WhatsApp, and a few of the other ones if you want to look at the technical details of it. Again, I realize I'm running out of time a bit, so I usually spend a fair bit of time on cell phone practices. Generally, this is a question of like going to a demonstration cell phone practice. So I would say to start with, ask yourself real specifically, do I need my phone with me? Most times you don't. The younger you are, I feel like the more you feel like you need it. But I think this question should be taken pretty seriously. And if you do need your phone, why do you need your phone? Is it to take pictures? Cool, bring a camera, right? Is it because you need a map? Bring a map, right? Is it because you need to communicate with your affinity group? Okay, get radios. So like, sure, your phone is a tracking device, and I have a phone. I have an iPhone, right? Like, but it tracks my location. Like, there's nothing. There's very little you can do about that. So again, really ask yourself real hard. Do I need to bring my phone here? And ask yourself, can I bring a burner phone, right? Can I bring a $25 flip phone, which will make phone calls and receive text messages, but do nothing else? Because that's probably a better option for you. Again, there's a lot here. If you're going to bring your cool smartphone, which most of us do, here are some minimal things you should do. You should use a virtual private network. You should install it on your phone. You should use Signal for all of your text messages because Signal is an encrypted text message application. And it's been shown in court that Signal does not have the information the government's asking for. If your phone is seized, the only thing Signal can provide to the government is the last time you logged on and the date your account was created. None of the content and none of the metadata. They can't say who you were talking to, how frequently, and what the content was. I would also suggest, depending on what you're doing, right? There's a difference between privacy and anonymity. Signal links to your phone number. So if you want to be able to have an encrypted and anonymous way, you need to register Signal with a number that's not your phone number. That I think you can use your Google Voice number for. That's fine, right? You can use this burner app is a popular thing. I use a program called MySudo, SUDO, which is like $10 a year, and you get you can change your phone number, as much as you want. I love that, and you can use it to do two-factor authentication. You can do it to register lots of things. Just as a tip, a lot of people are like, I can't figure out how to get this set up. Sometimes these systems like Google Voice, you can't receive text messages. But when you're doing the two-factor authentication, the thing that sends you the text message, there's usually an option where it calls you and it tells you that, that number with your voice. So just play around with it. And again, I'm happy to help people with that. You also want to make sure the phone is updated, make sure the apps are updated. You want to make sure the default encryption is enabled. Again, iPhones have this come standard unless you mess with the settings. You want to set a PIN on your SIM card. Again, you can Google how to do all this, but that prevents your SIM card from being removed. You want to create a 10-digit, and I know it's long. You want to create a 10-digit password. And if you want to, if anyone's interested, I can show you how long it takes to crack a 10-digit passcode versus how long it takes to crack a 7-digit passcode. And it's a difference between hours and years. So you need to install a 10-digit passcode because that's going to outpace technology. Again,
Michael?
Yeah, please.
I have somebody asking, what are those burner apps called?
Yeah, so there's one called Burner App. It's like literally called Burner App. It's like burnerapp.com. Burner App is something that basically allows you to make disposable cell phone numbers. So let's say you just need a phone number to do a two-factor authentication. And again, just to be clear, 2FA, two-factor authentication, is when you log into something and typically it sends you like a text message with some numbers. So Burner App is good if you let's say you want to register a new Gmail account, okay? And to do that, you need to get a phone number, right, to pass the first two-factor authentication. You can use Burner App to create a phone number that works for a temporary period, pass that two-factor authentication, and then ditch that number. I like MySudo for it, just because the nature of the work that I do, I need to maintain these false identities for months or years at a time. So I like MySudo. It basically gives you a phone number, an email address, and a phone number and email address. Phone number and email address to use. I mostly use it for the phone number. But any of those work. Again, a Google Voice number, which is free, it's fine for setting up things. Because again, it means that if some malicious person, so let's say you meet someone on the street and they're kind of sketchy and you want to have an encrypted conversation with them, but you don't want to give them your actual phone number, right? Then you give them a Google Voice number and you can register Signal with that. You also want to disable fingerprint scan and face scan, right? You want a short lockout time. So if your phone is taken from you, it's not going to be dumped. I talked to someone a few days ago who was arrested at a street demonstration, and basically they were taking pictures. And so when they were thrown to the ground, the police just picked up their phone. The cop was smart enough to look at the phone and say, oh my God, it's not locked, and literally pass it to a cop where they plugged it right into what's called a gray shift machine, which is something which just sucks all the data off of it. If the lockout code was set to 5 seconds, that probably wouldn't have worked. I don't know what theirs was set to, but all of their data was seized. And what that data is, what constitutes all that data, again, that's a separate training, but that's a lot of stuff, a lot. You want to log out of accounts you don't need, and you want to disable things which set your location, specifically GPS, near field communication, Bluetooth or Wi-Fi. A lot of people just use airplane mode for this. I think that's fine. It does something slightly different, but for the sake of the conversation, I think it's fine. The other thing you can do is get a burner phone, right? So let me, I always say screenshot this phone. I'm not going to go through this, but here's some of the settings I'd suggest. This is basic setup for iPhone and Android. Most of this is taken from the surveillance self-defense from the EFF, which is awesome. And if you're willing to spend a half an hour and $100, I would and you go into the streets for demonstrations a lot, I would strongly suggest looking at this. It's a great article called "How to Prepare a Cheap Burner Phone for Protesting," published by The Intercept. It has a 25-minute video which walks you through it. You can do it for about $100, and you can have a phone which would work for years. I would strongly suggest people do this. There's no reason for people to bring a tracking device with all of our passwords saved on it to a protest. We're going to get arrested at. It makes no sense. And we need to start getting better at that. So again, I just want to kind of leave this there and move on. This is, again, meant to be a one-stop shop if people are tool-centric, right? I've tried to be really clear here that the solution to your insecurity is not a bunch of new tools. It's not. It's really thinking about your lifestyle and your design a different way. However, if you want to use different tools, here's my suggestions. Again, these are all included in the slides, so I won't go through them individually. If people have questions, we can obviously talk about them. But here's what you should use. Getting a VPN should probably be the first step, and there's a ton of them. I like that one privacy site.net, which is a really good comparison. Some people want free, some people want in a non-extradition country, some people want, there's all different features you might want. And again, I'm happy to chat with people about that after. Again, sometimes it's as easy as migrating services. Like if you're using things on the left, try the things on the right, right? If you're using text messaging or Facebook or GChat, stop, right? Use anything else. Use Signal, Keybase, Wire, or WhatsApp. I love Wire. I think Wire's awesome. It's basically, if you've not used Wire, it's like Slack, but it's encrypted. And it's really, really great. If you're used to using Skype, which I don't know anyone's using Skype, use FaceTime. FaceTime's actually encrypted. FaceTime to FaceTime communication is encrypted for under 33 users. And Wire is also encrypted. Wire's always encrypted, but it's free for 4 users. If you're using Zoom, where you can use Jitsi, Jitsi is very similar, or you could use what I call Zoom Plus, which is Zoom with all of these really complicated settings, which again, I can show people. They're included in the slides you download. This slide is included in your slide download. I'm not going to go through it because it's silly for me to read settings to you off the screen, but these are my suggestions for how to make Zoom safer. So again, if you're used to using Google Docs or Notes, which a lot of us are, stop using those things, again, if you need to secure them, and move them into other things. CryptPad is almost identical to the way Google Docs looks, but it's encrypted, for example. And again, we can go through any of these individually. So again, as I've said, in an age of conspiracy charges where people are basically doing things and being told that it's conspiracy, you want to just avoid creating information that you then have to hide. Don't create a lot of things and try to hide it all. It's not going to work. So this is the last slide I have. What can I start doing today? Because I just kind of gave you a ton of different things. Well, one, you can purchase an annual VPN, and it's like, 30 bucks a year maybe for like a decent one. Install it on your phone and your laptop. Update your browsers, install recommended add-ons. I like Mozilla, and I like the add-ons it has for privacy. The second thing is I would set up 3 different email accounts, all of which are encrypted. I would use one, which is basically a spam account, just to register for things which you have to give your email address for. I would have one for your so-called political work, and I would have a third, which is just for your normal day-to-day, friends and family. I would make 3 different ones. And you can integrate those into one mail reader, but I would make 3 different accounts. I would also get a phone number, which is not your own phone number, and use that to register all of your devices. Again, there is a good guide here. I know it's kind of hard to read, but it's also an Intercept article, which is how to install Signal with a second phone number. So you may have 2 different phone numbers operating, one of which is your actual phone number and one of which you're just using for political work. I would strongly suggest doing that today. Again, yesterday, you should have started using encrypted communication. There's a lot of reasons to do this, but the main reason is that you don't get arrested and the government has access to everything you've ever said in every text message. Again, you want to also migrate other platforms. If you're used to using Wire, or if you're used to using Slack, just use Wire. It looks basically the same. You're used to using G Suite, Google Docs and Google Drive, move to CryptPad. It's very, very similar. So just migrate the services to better services. You want to secure your logins, right? Set up a password manager. Password manager allows you to have unique, different, complicated passwords, but not remember them all. And then change all your passwords, right? Go through and change every single password in your life. That's good to do once a year. I would also encourage you to install an authenticator. An authenticator is one of those things that gives you a weird series of numbers that's used for 2-factor authentication. I use LastPass. There's a ton of them. If you're a university student, you might be familiar with Duo, which a lot of universities use. Google Authenticator is also just fine, although it seems like it shouldn't be, but it seems fine. And then you want to activate 2-factor authentication on every single thing you can. It's not a perfect defense. Like there are ways to still break it, but it secures it a hell of a lot. And again, someone like me who does pretty public work, I get hits to my 2-factor authentication weekly. In other words, like I'll get messages at least once a week that says, here's your Twitter login. I'm like, I didn't just try to log into Twitter. And I was like, oh, someone's trying to log into my Twitter somewhere. And it's sending me these 2-factor authentications. I get those a lot. And maybe it's because of the work I do, but if it does show you that people are out there looking to do you harm. 6, you want to back up your information, right? And you want to back it up in a way that's not on an insecure server. Don't back it all up to iCloud because iCloud is insecure. right? You can back it, and there's ways to do encryption and things like that. It's not outside the realm of possibility, but it is more challenging. I would suggest you back up everything to one physical place and hide it in a friend's house somewhere real secure. And the second thing is that you back it up online to a zero knowledge cloud, pcloud, sync.com, TrueSort, something like that. And then the last thing, and again, depending on how much social media you use, this could be a big deal or not a big deal, but start by making yourself harder to dox, right? And there's a lot of ways we can do that. Here's again, if people want to read more, those are 4 websites I'm suggesting, and some publications which I think are within my within the same kinds of things I'm telling you. For anyone interested in kind of the broader world of policing and spying and repression and intelligence, these are the books I really like. These are the ones I consider like the first things you should read. Yeah, they're really interesting. And that's my email address again, or name or whatever. So I'll leave it there. We have about 20 some odd minutes for questions, and then I can skip back around to slides depending on what questions people have.